What we're going to talk about tonight, which I think I'm right in saying is the fourth lecture of this series, is what we call the human revolution and what Nichiren Daishonin, the founder of this Buddhism, called Kosen Rufu. I'll explain both terms, taking as the human revolution. This is quite a modern phrase, as one might imagine, and it was first used by a Mr. Toda, who was the second president of the lay society of Nichiren Buddhism in Japan. He became the president at the end of World War II. And this phrase, human revolution, is really a very apt one, because it means basically the reformation of one's life and way of living through the power of this practice. Or you might say, in another way, it's the overcoming of the negative and destructive tendencies which Buddhism points out are inherent in human life, and turning all those thoughts, words, and deeds into something positive and valuable. That might be another meaning of the word human revolution. Or a third meaning could be the act of changing the unhappy aspects of one's destiny or karma into something. On that point of karma or destiny, I hope you understand that this is the name given to the chain of causes and effects that cause one continually to repeat the same kind of actions which lead you into unhappiness. Of course, there is also good karma, which is where you repeat those causes and the effects of things that cause you happiness. But the purpose of Buddhism basically is to change your destiny, to change those aspects of your karma which you constantly repeat, leading one into unhappiness and often despair. So this is the whole purpose of the Buddhist practice, and this is the meaning of human revolution. Now, the word Kosen Rufu by us in Kosen means to spread the teachings of the Buddhist philosophy and practice. Speaking very generally, to spread the teachings of the philosophy and practice. And Rufu means that practice and philosophy becomes gradually established in society and known to most people. So Kosen Rufu, the word Kosen Rufu together, means the establishment of peace and happiness through the practice of Buddhism in a country or in the world. Indeed, even in a family, or in a village, or community, or in a town, or city. Kosen Rufu can be, in other words, in many levels. You could even say that the human revolution is one's own personal establishment of Kosen Rufu, the establishment of happiness and peace in one's life through the practice. So Kosen Rufu is a very realistic concept. It doesn't imagine that the entire world will be chanting Nam-myoho Renge Kyo necessarily. Nor even in a family does it necessarily mean that every single person in the family is practicing. But what it means is that there are enough people practicing, and there are enough people supporting those who are practicing, because they see the value and the wisdom of the actions of those people in order to actually influence and lead society. So in other words, putting it in stupidly mathematical terms, One might say that the concept of Kosen Rufu is that, say, 1/3 of the world, or of a country, or of a family, are chanting Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, and that there is another third who are so impressed by the result that these people get, who will follow their lead even though they don't practice themselves. And there's a further 1/3 who couldn't care less anyway. So, in other words, in this concept of Kosen Rufu, Buddhism, as always, is recognizing that the negative and destructive tendencies of life are an inherent part of life, and indeed play an essential role in life. So those of you who listen to the lecture on the 10 worlds, you will remember that each of those basic 10 states of life has the possibility of acting and reacting negatively or positively. And the purpose of this practice is to make sure that each of those worlds or states which are inherent in life always act and react positively and valuably. So Buddhism recognized, therefore, that life inherently consists of good and evil, value and anti-value, negative and positive. And the purpose of the practice is to recognize that and overcome that negative tendency in every state of life. You remember the states of life: hell, hunger, anger, animality, tranquility, rapture, and then the 4 higher worlds: learning, partial enlightenment, bodhisattva, or the desire to help others, and Buddha. So those 9 worlds, other than Buddha, all have the ability to act and react negatively and destructively. And the purpose of the practice is to make them positive and valuable. So I hope that concept of Kosen Rufu is clear to you. And the understanding that Kosen Rufu is not just a view of the whole world, but it's also a view of a society or a community at that level as well. So, in other words, you could say that Kosen Rufu is the sum total of human revolution which has taken place in a number of individuals in a group, whereas the human revolution normally refers to one person only. In other words, you get a group like a family or a neighborhood or a village or a town, and in that community there are people who are really working at their lives and doing their human revolution, and the sum total of that effort creates what is called in Buddhism Kosen Rufu. So you can see from that the aims of Nichiren Buddhism, of its whole practice and philosophy, is first and most essentially to reform oneself, to overcome those negative and destructive tendencies which I was talking about earlier. And through that, to discover one's own true greater self, which is revealed through the overcoming and the supremacy, if you like, of one's life over those negative tendencies. And secondly, is to teach others to do the same, so that a happier world can be created, which is Kosen Rufu. And thirdly, through one's own human revolution and one's ability to enable others to start their human revolution, you can then change society itself and eradicate the causes of war, pollution, violence, which are affecting this world so terribly at the moment. So the uniqueness of this practice, and I'm sure I've said this before in this series of lectures, is that not only does it give you an amazingly great, all-embracing philosophy, but it gives you a practice which provides you with the power to actually live that philosophy. And this is very unusual in this world. The world's full of philosophies and ideals. But usually the power cannot be attained to sustain such a high and noble philosophy. Whereas Buddhism provides you with a practice. So you can see from that the aims of Nichiren Buddhism, of its whole practice and philosophy, is firstly and most essentially to reform oneself, to overcome those negative and destructive tendencies which I was talking about earlier. And through that, to discover one's own true greater self, which is revealed through the overcoming and the supremacy, if you like, of one's life over those negative tendencies. And secondly, is to teach others to do the same so that a happier world can be created, which is Kosen Rufu. And thirdly, through one's own human revolution and one's ability to enable others to start their human revolution, you can then change society itself and eradicate the causes of war, pollution, violence, which are affecting this world so terribly at the moment. So the uniqueness of this practice, and I'm sure I've said this before in this series of lectures, is that not only does it give you an amazingly great, all-embracing philosophy, but it gives you a practice which provides you with the power to actually live that philosophy. And this is very unusual in this world. The world's full of philosophies and ideals. But usually the power cannot be attained to sustain such a high and noble philosophy. Whereas Buddhism provides you with a practice. At this point, I'd like to quote from one of the writings of Nichiren Daishonin, who I think you all know founded this Buddhism when he declared Nam-myoho Renge-kyo in 1253. In a writing called The Gift of Rice, he said, "The true path of life lies in the affairs of this world." The 6th volume of the Lotus Sutra reads, "No affairs of life or work are in any way different from the ultimate reality." Just read that again. The true path of life lies in the affairs of this world. The 6th volume of the Lotus Sutra reads, "No affairs of life or work are in any way different from the ultimate reality." So in other words, Buddhism equals daily life. Every aspect of daily life is Buddhism, and every aspect of daily life is embraced by its philosophy and practice. So true Buddhism is not escapism. It's not sitting on some mountaintop meditating while the world goes on in its usual awful way down below. Neither is true Buddhism a matter of ritual and ceremony for priests and monks. Nichiren Daishonin's teaching, and indeed the teaching of the Lotus Sutra, which Shakyamuni preached 3,000 years ago, is all aimed towards people understanding that Buddhism is daily life, that every aspect of daily life is embraced by Buddhism. And through the practice of Buddhism, every aspect of that daily life can be transformed into something valuable, and therefore something which causes one the deepest happiness. So satisfaction. The human revolution is achieved by what we call the three practices. The three practices being, firstly, the practice for yourself, which is chanting Nam-myoho Renge Kyo and reciting what we call the ceremony of Gongyo, morning and evening. That'll be the subject of another lecture. And secondly, practice for others, to spread happiness through others being able to achieve their own human revolution through the practice. And thirdly, study. Study not in an academic sense, not the sort of study one did at school, but to grasp the spirit of Buddhism and indeed the qualities, and the wisdom and the compassion of the Buddha through reading the Buddhist writings. Through that, we understand what is going on in our own lives. And secondly, we are able to relate to the practice itself by understanding gradually the significance of Nam-myoho Renge Kyo and of the Gohonzon, which we practice too. And thirdly, of course, study to understand the theory of the teachings enables us to answer people's questions when we're spreading Buddhism. In this respect, of course, as human beings, we're incredibly sensitive, aren't we, to what goes on in our environment. In Buddhism, this is a principle called Esho Funi. Esho Funi, E-S-H-O, another word, F-U-N-I, the inseparability of man and his environment. Man or woman will always react to what is happening in the environment. Something happens in the environment to make one sad or happy, to feel joyful, to feel angry, and so on. And vice versa. Buddhism also points out that what happens in man or woman also affects the environment. If one is angry, that anger affects everything in your path, doesn't it? If one is happy, that happiness radiates and affects everything that surrounds one. So truly, this is an incredibly important principle, yet it's not understood in this world, is it? That everything that occurs in man or woman affects the environment of that person, and vice versa. If we'd understood this, there certainly would be no pollution, because people would have understood that their actions, if they were not in harmony with nature, would cause serious disturbance to the harmony of the world as a whole. So, of course, there are other amazing examples, aren't there? I'm thinking there of the story of several stories where children have been suckled by wolves, for example. And although they're human children, they grow up thinking that they're a wolf. We're amazingly susceptible to our environment. So I'd like just for a moment at this point to look at human revolution as it can be applied also to our historical past, not in the sense of Buddhism, but generally in the world. So really, it could be said that every religion has aimed towards a human revolution. Certainly all the higher religions, as they're known. First of all, those religions tried to elevate the state of mankind through precepts and commandments. And this includes Buddhism. In Shakyamuni Buddha's early teachings, he gave a series of precepts and commandments, the aim of which was to try to heighten or elevate the moral standards of those times. But after a time, religion began to dig deeper as history continued, and eventually reached the point where this and that religion were promoting reformation of oneself through prayer, And this much deeper approach to the problems of life through religion led, of course, to a great change in the culture of society generally. And this change in culture, this elevation of the arts, for instance, through music and literature and so on, had its own reaction in turn on the minds and the lives of the people. As people began to get a higher understanding of these arts, so naturally their life state became generally elevated. So in other words, a change in the environment, in the arts and other cultural aspects of society, began to have an effect. So certainly, if you look historically at, say, the Middle Ages, religion was successful for a time in heightening values, in elevating people's thoughts. During the Middle Ages, when the great cathedrals were built, probably those higher religions, as they're called today, were at their zenith. And truly amazing results came from the effect of this religion on the people in the form of arts and culture generally. About perhaps 200 years ago, things began to change, as you know. Science began to make its discoveries more and more deeply, and the people, strangely enough, rather than broadening their view of life, their understanding of life through these scientific discoveries, began to pin their hopes to the discovery from the point of view of its material value, to the surface well-being of people. And the effect of this was the rapid growth of what Buddhism terms the three poisons. The three poisons being anger, or if you like, ruthless competitiveness, and greed, avarice, and stupidity. For the truth is that as science and materialism grew, so human beings began to lose their wisdom and concentrate their minds and lives on material possession. Through this, of course, the poison of greed, grasping all you can get, and the poison of anger, competitiveness with one's neighbor, became more and more prominent and more a part of society, certainly throughout the Western world. And mankind's view became one of profit and fame and fortune and self-satisfaction. Today, we see a strange world, I think, in the West, where people, due to this shallow, competitive society, have resorted to specialization. We lack today people with a broad view of life, people who have the time and the ability to develop their wisdom and compassion. Life is a rat race, isn't it? People go to school, they're put in a particular ditch or channel, perhaps it's economics, whatever, business, so on, and they have to follow that line in a very narrow way for the rest of their lives, usually because of the pressures of having to live. The old days where people could broaden their views by wide experience have, for the time being anyway, gone very largely. So we don't breed today men or women with a broad, general, deep view of life. Instead of that, we breed specialists, I believe. In saying that, of course, I'm saying something from a personal point of view. Now, at the same time as this happened, the growth of materialism, our environment was getting absolutely colossal. In the early days, in the Middle Ages, which I was talking about earlier, man's environment was very small, wasn't it? It was the vicinity of his own village and the patch which he cultivated and the neighbors that he lived amongst in that small community. By and large, this was the way mankind lived. But today, and over the past 100 years, through communications, speeding up, developing, through travel, through the immense flow of knowledge which the media produce and which are produced in books and other forms of literature, the environment is now huge. So that today, what happens in Vietnam, for example, affects everyone else in the world. Whereas 200 years ago, what happened in Vietnam would have had very little effect on the people living perhaps in some small village in Buckinghamshire. So everything has hugely changed. And religion, I believe, has been unable to cope with this change. As the environment has grown and become greater, so it's proved that the religious precepts and commandments are inadequate to cope with the immense variety of problems which the human race now face. The incredibly diverse situations that mankind is faced with as compared with 200 or 300 years ago. So the rules of Judaism, say, or Islam, or Christianity, so often are unable to cope with the problems of this modern age. And indeed that applies to Buddhism also. The rules and precepts which Shakyamuni Buddha preached in the first days of his teachings, or the first years of his teachings 3,000 years ago, are no longer of help to people in this age. And Shakyamuni himself predicted that this would happen. So in the latter years of his life, he taught that 2,000 years after he died, the world would enter an age which he called Mappo, when confusion and fear ruled the lives of human beings. And this, of course, is the age that we're living in now. So if you take some examples, which I think are contemporary ones, you can't nowadays say that sex should only be for childbirth, when man has invented pills and devices which encourage sex anywhere and everywhere. And the world, into the bargain, is tending towards overpopulation. Or as another example, you can't say that divorce should result in excommunication when you know that people in the next door country permit it. So in so many ways, these old rules and precepts, which at one time guided people's lives, are no longer sufficiently down to earth for people to follow. And of course, we've also seen the confusion brought about by this situation. We've seen it result in the growth of bureaucracy, where the rule makers desperately try to create more and more rules and regulations, and in the end create a jungle which has really resulted in man almost losing his freedom, and in some cases actually losing it. So the decline in religion and religious belief inevitably, of course, has had a most desperate and serious result on society, hasn't it? It's resulted in a total reaction in the opposite way to what those rules and commandments and precepts were aiming at. It's resulted in the perhaps over-permissive society of today. It's resulted this vacuum that's been left due to the decline of the efficacy of those commandments in 2 world wars and in the moral vacuum that we see around us everywhere. So there's been, in other words, a total swing from something that was strict and codified to something which is totally loose. Or if to like to put it another way, there's been a tendency to swing from moralism to hedonism. But this, of course, has led to tremendous confusion amongst any thinking person. People are desperately concerned about the state of society, aren't they? But they don't know how to change it. Over the weekend, our papers were full of these really agonizing pictures and reports on Liverpool. It makes one's heart sick, doesn't it, to see young people who, one could say, through no fault of their own, but through the state of society today, reach a point at which they can only satisfy themselves by such utter cruelty. This violence is the stupid state of the world at this moment. And we have to face this fact. And really, ever since the higher religions, as they're called, began to lose their power, we've seen a constant swing to and fro from one extreme to another. So just listing them down as I did here, you could say that in the 1900s was the era of escape. People emigrated in large numbers to the United States and Australia and Canada to get away from the confusion and ills of the old world. And the 1910s saw World War. And the 1920s saw a reaction to the slaughter of that war in escapism towards, if you like, hedonism, the roaring 20s, and all the rest. And the 30s saw another swing beginning, a swing of deeply serious thought towards the state of the world, a tendency towards pacifism, particularly in this country, in movements such as the Oxford Union and so on. And the 40s saw war again, a war which was waged on the evil idea that a race could remain supreme as long as it purified itself of any other tainted blood. And through that, supremacy ruled the world. And the 50s was the era of the Cold War, the era of mistrust, one human being for another, one country for another. And the 60s saw another reaction, didn't it? The young people, the hippies, the beginning of the drugs movement, the Beatles, and so on. A reaction against what was obviously a decline in the standard of the world. In the 70s, perhaps you could say, saw another form of escapism into dreams of the world of space, into the revival of religious movements with a distinctly romantic theme behind it, such as Christ Superstar. And now, what are we seeing in the 80s so far? I'm afraid it's nothing but violence and terror. This extraordinary swing from one side to another in standards of behavior and thought, of course, is merely an expression of confusion. Human beings are totally confused. They've lost the commandments and the precepts of the ancient religions. Above anything else, though they may find it, I believe, difficult to realize, they need a rock on which to base their lives. They need, above all, a practice which will enable them to stay on that rock. They desire some foundation of wisdom to enable them to make decisions. And they require some belief in the fact that there is, in fact, sufficient power and influence in human life to overcome the terrible state of the world that we're in at the moment. In other words, really, what everyone is desiring, though it may be difficult to put in words, is to discover happiness. And that after all, a human being is capable of being really great. That there is something in one's life which can enable one to steer a course which is valuable and great and which will bring fulfillment and happiness. This is what I believe human beings are more and more searching. And I think the large numbers of people who go to such exhibitions as, I think it's called, is it the Mind and Body exhibition at Olympia? People who go in tens of thousands is proof of the fact that so many are seeking the solution to their own problems and the problems of the world. So as I said right at the beginning, the whole purpose of Buddhism is to provide the solution to those problems and the power to carry them out. This is the situation which Shakyamuni Buddha saw 3,000 years ago. All that long time ago, he said in the terrible age of Mappa, only his supreme teaching, which was the Lotus Sutra, would have the power to give people's happiness. And 700 years ago, Nichiren Daishonin took the Lotus Sutra and extracted its essence in that phrase, Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, and declared that if people would chant those seemingly simple words, they would find themselves in rhythm with the rhythm of the whole universe, and at last would be able to build creative and happy lives. So, of course, those of us who start to practice so soon get the experience that this is so. Something is changing. Something is changing inside. Something is changing in one's environment. And as you pursue that practice, so its power and efficacy, its ability to change one's negative, destructive tendencies into positive and valuable ones becomes more and more and more apparent. Oh, this is an incredible thing. So then the human revolution, in other words, I'd like at this cover just to read one more extracts from Nichiren Daishonin's writings. These are in a gosha called On Attaining Buddhahood. The first one is this: you must never seek any of Shakyamuni's teachings or the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the universe outside yourself. Your mastery of the Buddhist teachings will not relieve you of mortal sufferings in the least unless you perceive the nature of your own life. If you seek enlightenment outside yourself, any discipline or good deed will be meaningless. For example, a poor man cannot earn a penny just by counting his neighbor's wealth, even if he does so night and day. In other words, the purpose of the Buddhist practice and teachings is the discovery that the highest state of life, which is Buddhahood, actually exists in every single one of us. The purpose of the practice is to reveal that. And through revealing that, in experience after experience after experience, we discover that this higher state of life has done battle with the lower states of life and has succeeded in overcoming them. And the human revolution in our own lives begins. This is why he says that these teachings will not relieve us of mortal sufferings in the least unless we perceive the nature of our own lives. In other words, we perceive that Buddha actually exists in every single human being. So the purpose of the practice is to gradually reveal this, that the wisdom, the compassion, the courage, and the power of the Buddha actually exists in every single one of us. And then in the same writing, he went on to say, for example, the Jomyo Sutra says the Buddha's enlightenment is to be found in human life, thus showing that common mortals can attain Buddhahood and that sufferings of birth and death can be transformed into nirvana. It further states that if the minds of the people are impure, their land is also impure. But if their minds are pure, so is their land. There are not two lands, pure or impure in themselves. The difference lies solely in the good or evil of our mind. That's a very famous quotation, but an incredibly profound one. And of course, it is revealing that same principle that I mentioned to you before, called Eshofuni, the inseparability of man and his environment. If the minds of the people are impure, their land is also impure. But if their minds are pure, so is their land. There are not two lands, pure and impure in themselves. The difference lies solely in the good or evil of our minds. So as in all things with Buddhism, based as it is on a profound understanding of the law of cause and effect, we reap what we create. The land that we see at the moment in the United Kingdom is the result of causes and effects of the sum total of all the human beings in this land. If it is impure, it is because of the impurity of people's minds. If it is to become pure, then it's the minds of the people that must become pure. This, after all, is nothing else but the human revolution, which the teachings of Nichiren Daishonin set out to do. So, of course, in the past, people thought that they could change things through, for example, various isms, communism, materialism, and so on. In other words, they thought that they could create a pure land through trying to change the environment. But painfully, it's been shown to us all that that simply doesn't work. The truth is contained in those lines from the Goshen. It's the minds of people that have to be purified if the land is to become pure in itself. So how to do it? Nichiren Daishonin, of course, then continued to teach that. And he pointed out a principle which in Japanese is called Juji Soku Kanjin. Don't worry about that too much. But the English meaning of that is to receive and embrace is to observe one's mind. Juji Soku Kanji, to receive and embrace. In other words, to receive the teaching of Nam-myoho Renge Kyo and the Gohonzon, and embrace it, that is to say, to do one's utmost to practice it, will lead one to kanjin, to observe one's life or mind. And through observing one's life or mind, develops quite naturally the desire to change those aspects which one realizes have caused one unhappiness, and in the process have caused a lot of other people unhappiness as well. So this is the process that one goes through the practice. You receive and embrace, and through embracing or practicing, one observes one's life, not only the bad things, but also you get glimpses of the wisdom and the compassion of the Buddha actually working in one's own life in situations where it would never have worked before. You realize it's really, there must be something in it. The Buddha state must be in me. And you see that there are various impediments to its full blossoming and development in one's life. And then through the power of the practice, one finds one can actually change those impediments and reveal more and more this higher state. So I'd like to emphasize this is not repression. This is not control in the sense we understand. This is not willpower, except in making oneself get down to it and practice. This is an actual 180-degree change in one's life. In other words, Buddhism doesn't deny any of the states of life in their destructive and worst side. It recognizes the natural existence of this in everybody. But by elevating the higher state or Buddha state, it has the power to change any of those other states of life as they're drawn through it, 180 degrees from negative to positive, from that anti-value to value, and so on. This is not, therefore, repression, but truly it's change. Truly it's revolution within one's own life. So this change is carried about, this human revolution is carried out through those three practices that I mentioned. The practice for yourself of Gongyo and Daimoku is for purification. Through that exercise of Gongyo, every morning and every evening, we purify our senses. This is the purpose of that practice. And through the power of the Daimoku, or prayer, chanting of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, we express our desires in, as the theory of Ichinan Sanzen teaches, I can't go into today, in 3,000 different ways, both into oneself and out into the environment. This is something incredibly powerful, which every single human being possesses, yet it lies latent in so many and is never used. So the purpose of Gongyo and Daimoku is to activate that latent power of the Buddha state that exists in us all. The second practice, you remember, was teaching others. Through this, you also bring benefit to yourself. Through teaching others, you see your own life reflected on it. Through devoting yourself to helping someone else find happiness. Through helping others, you take yourself out of yourself. And by that very action, you cut the chain of your desires, which has shackled one for so long, following the same course of cause and effect through the chain of one's selfish desires. The action of helping others, teaching others, is what cuts that chain every time you do it until it weakens it, and finally it disintegrates and you change your unhappy destiny. And then I said the third practice was study. to understand what is going on in your life and in the life of others, to understand how life ticks, the mechanics of life, to be able to see the differences and the changes in your life and in the life. Gosha said, if their minds are pure, so is their land. To elevate the highest state or Buddha state of life will create purity more and more and more in one's own life. And through this, it reflects purity into the environment. And the land, in time, as the number of people doing their human revolution grows, becomes pure in itself. This, of course, is based again on that principle of Eshofuni, the absolute interdependence or inseparability of every single being and its own particular environment. And the fact that all those environments are overlapping, just the same as all of our environments in this room are overlapping at this moment. What one does affects another. What someone does in Vietnam affects everybody in London, in one way or another. And indeed, what one person does, in the end, Buddhism would teach, affects the entire universe. This is a mind-boggling thought. But once one sees or can see this principle of Eshofuni in action, this becomes so clear to one. What someone does to the atmosphere in America affects everywhere else in the world. So the sum total of all these human revolutions, as I said, is Kosen Rufu, the changing of society. In another writing called The True Entity of Life, Nichiren Daishonin said this about the development of Kosen Rufu. Only I, Nichiren, at first chanted Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, but then 2, 3, and 100 followed, chanting and teaching others. Likewise, propagation will unfold in this way in the future. As surely as an arrow aimed at the earth cannot miss the target. So in other words, through the practice of Gongyo and Daimoku, chanting Nam-myoho Renge Kyo and reciting the sutra, we activate life force. And that life force, which bubbles up, if you like, in inexhaustible supplies inside us, inevitably overflows, and we desire to pass this heritage on to other people. And furthermore, the very chanting of Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, down the life link which connects us with every other living thing in our environment, affects the Buddha state in that living thing. Just the same as if we're angry, down that same life link, we affect other people by our anger. When we're in the Buddha state, it's the Buddha state in those other people and things that is affected. So gradually, the purification of ourselves purifies the environment. Certainly, at this present time, people simply cannot get it together so far as the future advance of our so-called civilization is concerned. Wherever we see progress, we also see chaos and confusion. Progress in no sense in this world is harmonious. And because of this chaos, everyone is trying desperately, those who are real thinking people, people who desire to see a better world, are wanting to find harmony. Yet, in their search for harmony, all they reach is a pathetic, rather weak compromise, which lasts for very little time, because it usually leads to stagnation and lack of progress. Yet, in this practice of Buddhism, as the human revolution grows and spreads, progress can continue to be dynamic, yet also it can be harmonious. What is the reason for this? The Buddhism expounds a theory in 3 words: ku, ke, and chu. Ku, ku, ke, and chu, che. Ke is the physical or material aspect of life. Ku is the spiritual or unseen aspect of life. Every religion's understood that. All the higher religions understood that there were those 2 aspects to life. But what they've groped and searched for, sometimes wittingly, knowingly, sometimes unwittingly, is what connects the 2. What is it that connects the seen or the material aspect of life with the unseen side of life? And because no one understood that, progress has never been harmonious since our so-called civilization began. But Buddhism names that connecting power Chu, or Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, the ultimate reality of life. Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, the force or rhythm which connects every living thing and which is the essence of every living thing. This is Chu, Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, or the Gohonzon. Therefore, through chanting Nam-myoho Renge Kyo and coming back to the Gohonzon at regular intervals during one's life, you are always putting your life into balance. You are hitching yourself up again, if you like, with the connecting link between the unseen and the seen aspects of life, with the spiritual and the physical, with the progressive aspect of life and the harmonious aspect of life. Chu is that point, prime point, or linking point of those 2 aspects of life. Through coming back to that regularly, then one follows a course of perfect balance. And, as I say, progress can be dynamic and yet harmonious. So in a very small way, we see this at work in our activities. If we put on a show or an extra special meeting, or in some amazing way, everything moves very dynamically, yet very harmonious. This is because everyone who is practicing is coming back to the prime point, to the linking point between Te and Ku. It is progressing in a harmonious way. This is what Kosen Rufu is, so far as society is concerned. Kosen Rufu is where there are enough people coming back to that prime point at regular intervals in their lives, in their daily lives, to make sure that they follow the course of perfect balance. This is not the course of compromise. It's the course of perfect balance between the progressive and harmonious aspects of life. This is an amazing thought, but we prove it in our own lives, first of all. We prove it because we discover that our environment is working with us more often than against us. And in the end, is working with us all the time. And then we prove it as a group, in a family, and so on. This is Kosen Rufu. So no politician, we believe, in Buddhism, no scheming mind or thinking mind can ever work out how to attain peace and stability, happiness in this world. Only the wisdom, or natural wisdom of human life, activated through the practice of Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, can provide the power and the wisdom. And so there are two types of Kosen Rufu. First is formal Kosen Rufu, and the second is actual. So formal Kosen Rufu was, in a sense, achieved when Nichiren Daishonin inscribed the Daiga Honzen in 1279. The Daiga Honzen, which still exists, and which is the prime point for all prayers and actions for the peace of this world. The Daiga Honzen, which is, if you like, the powerhouse. And the current from that is what enables us to obtain the power through the Honzens that we have in our own houses. Each is same power, transmitted, if you like, through the Honzen to ourselves. And actual Kosen Rufu is what we're doing now. In the actuality of daily life, we strive for Kosen Rufu in ourselves, in our families, in our workplaces, and in our communities. And of course, ultimately, in our countries and in the whole world. So it may seem a slow process, that the only way to peace is for man to change himself. But the truth of the matter is that there is no other way, I believe. So it may seem slow, but it's sure. And the whole purpose of our movement at this moment, throughout the world, is to spread this teaching of the human revolution, so that by the end of this century, there will be a sufficient great force of people to ensure that the balance of this world at last is held correctly and doesn't tilt in a downward way any further. So of course people may say, how do you know that there won't be a nuclear war between now and then? One can only go by the wisdom of the teachings. In the wisdom of the teachings, the year 2000 and 2001 is of vital importance. This is our target. Of course, it won't be worldwide Kosen Rufu by then, but at least there are enough people doing their human revolution and chanting Nam-myoho Renge Kyo to hold the balance and prevent the tilt towards destruction from getting any worse. And from then onwards, the tilt will begin to go the other way. This, in far too simple terms, is what the great movement for Kosen Rufu, which is already beginning all over the world, is aiming for. This is really unprecedented. Never before, I believe, in the history of mankind, have people in every part of the world moved in unity towards such an amazing aim. And that unity, of course, is achieved because every single one of them is chanting Nam-myoho Renge Kyo and following the rhythm of the universe itself. So this is quite unprecedented. And it's also very exciting. Sometimes we forget it when we're in our own small worlds. But the fact is that all over the world, there are an ever-increasing number of people who are changing their lives, doing their human revolution, and living in the rhythm of natural life itself. So, of course, this practice of Buddhism is a battle. It's a battle between the devilish nature of life and its opposite, the extreme of value and anti-value. This is the purpose of our daily practice and the whole purpose of the effort that we make from day to day, month by month, and year by year. But just as Nichiren Daishonin says, Kosen Rufu will be achieved just as surely as an arrow aims at a year. Since it's based on the rhythm of the universe, expresses its wisdom in the form of numbers or anniversaries. There is a rhythm to life, and this rhythm is marked by important anniversaries. So, for instance, this year, which is really the beginning of the march, or the voyage, if you like to call it that, to the 21st century, is the 700th anniversary of Nichiren Daishonin's passing. And Nichiren Daishonin's will and testament, if you like, all his efforts were towards the attainment of Kosen Rufu. So, whereas up to this year, one could say, speaking in broadly historical terms, the effort has been on a narrow basis, firstly in Japan and then gradually it spread to each country. From now on, it truly is in a natural way becoming a global effort. This has become apparent more and more because the numbers of people and their ability to travel backwards and forwards to each other, to get to know each other, to establish trust and friendship has increased and will increase more and more. And the facilities to enable us to do such things has also grown in accordance with that rhythm. So, for example, just a couple of weeks ago almost, we were able to hold a summer course in Europe, in the south of France, attended by representatives from nearly all the European countries. I think only Iceland, unfortunately, couldn't send someone. But that became possible. And the power of those people, both in strength and in finance also, enabled us to provide the buildings and the marquees and all the rest of it to feed and look after those people for the period of that effort. So gradually, in the rhythm of things, everything is progressive. So 2002 is the 750th anniversary of the founding of this Buddhism. That is to say, the 750th anniversary of the day on which Nichiren Daishonin actually declared Nam-myoho Renge-kyo for the first time. So these anniversaries mark the rhythm of Kosen Rufu in that way. In fact, there are writings which go much deeper into this rhythm than I can state here, and indeed, not all of those have yet been translated into English. But that, in a general way, is how this progress is marked into the future. Okay. Yes. You're not talking about me in the state of Buddhahood. No. Does one? Yes. No. Basically not. No. Because in the world of Buddhahood, once you reach a point where you can sustain it as the main tendency of your life, then all the other worlds, all the other states of life, inevitably have to pass through Buddhahood, right? And in the process, they turn, from anti-value to value. Or that's a very difficult question to answer, because in the very nature of things, mistakes are sometimes necessary in order to achieve great things. So I don't think that it would be right to say that on the surface of things, a person who is in the state of Buddhahood would never make mistakes. Because in fact, in the wisdom of life itself, a mistake may be necessary, as I say, in order to achieve something great. Okay. Yes, Chu is in fact another word for the ultimate reality. That is to say, the core or essence of life itself. It's also termed Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. That is to say, all phenomena, at the core of it, or at the essence of every phenomena, is Chu, the ultimate reality. And furthermore, of course, it is that ultimate reality which is linking the movements and actions of every single thing. So the ultimate reality, or Chu, is revealed in the state or aspect of Ku or Ke, through the unseen side of life and through the seen side of life. Yes, is that clear? So, in other words, what Buddhism is saying is that if you're going to lead a happy, progressive, and valuable life, you must come back, as it were, to that ultimate reality. Some philosophers have used the term the very ground of life, haven't they? The core, kernel, the essence of life. You have to get back to that and, as it were, ride in its rhythm if you're going to be able to follow a course of life which is both progressive and harmonious. Does that make sense? And Nichiren Daishonin expressed that ultimate reality in that phrase, Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, or rather, Myoho Renge Kyo, the law itself being Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, to devote yourself to it. Okay. Of course, expressed in such words, it sounds too simple to be true. But the amazing thing is that when you do it, you prove it to be true. And although Myoho Renge Kyo or Nam-myoho Renge Kyo is a very simple sounding phrase, yet, of course, the depth of its meaning goes on forever. You could write books and books about each syllable. Not at all. It's a very good question. So, faith or belief in Buddhism is simply to do the three practices as the Buddha taught. In other words, faith in Buddhism is revealed in action. For some reason, it is often difficult to believe, isn't it? One gets down to it and decides to try chanting. This is faith, the action of doing those three practices. Then, through that action, you get the proof. And of course, it's true that then the proof, which you're constantly receiving, is what drives you on to practice more. But everything, and indeed, Nichiren Daishonin often stressed the need or the importance of a seeking mind. In other words, one should always be seeking or digging deeper and deeper into life through Buddhism. And through the combination of the practice and that seeking spirit, you will always get the proof, or the answer, if you like, to your full satisfaction. So in that sense, there's no such thing as blind faith in Buddhism. There's no such thing as people saying to you, you've got to believe in a particular sort of teaching or philosophy, except the one precept, as Nichiren Daishonin said, was to chant Nam-myoho Renge Kyo and recite the sutra and teach others and study the three practices. Okay, so that is faith in Buddhism. All right, great. Thank you for the question. Anything else? Yes. My goodness. Did you all hear the question? The question is, how different is Kyo and Chi from Ku and Chu? They're totally different. Yeah, well, Kyo and Chi is Kyo is object and chi is subject. Okay? So, in fact, that principle of kyo and chi refers to one's practice to the Gonzen specifically. The Gonzen being kyo, possessed of the Buddha state, and chi being you and your subjective self. Right? So that relationship of kyo and chi then fuses into one is called myoga. In other words, eventually through that relationship between the Gonzen with the Buddha state and your life with its Buddha state, one reacts on the other and draws it out. So that is kyo and chi. Ku and chu. Ku is, as I said, the unseen or spiritual aspect of life. Chu is the ultimate reality or point that draws the physical and the spiritual together and enables them to act in harmony. Yeah, okay. Anything else? Great. Well, yes, one more. Well, I think, how long have you been practicing? Yes. Well, I think that is it. The other great advantage, or one of the many great advantages of practicing regularly every day is that you more and more engrave that practice or rhythm into your life. So that after, even a few months, whatever happens, you'll find yourself, without even realizing it, chanting Nam Myoho Renge Kyo inside yourself. In any crisis moment, if you start skidding in your car, unconsciously you'll find yourself doing it. You'll even find yourself chanting in your dreams. So it's you're not yet reached that point where it's becoming engraved into your life, but it doesn't take very long. Well, don't be too hard on yourself because you've only been practicing for a very short time. And that's why that spontaneous reaction to chant immediately didn't come to you. But on the other hand, now you can really chant to turn poison into good medicine, right? So your determination now should be to get a much better job with a much higher salary. Fantastic. So, well done. Great. So please pursue that, and really, really chant to turn poison into good medicine. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much indeed for listening patiently, and I'm sure you're dying to get out into the fresh air. Very many thanks. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.